At my son's housewarming party, he humiliated me in front of all his friends by calling me the old tenant who won't move out. He thought he was being clever. What he didn't know was that I had been secretly paying his mortgage for 2 years while he bragged about his success. The revenge I served him that night left everyone at the party speechless, and he learned exactly who the real owner of his dream house was. I'm Evelyn, and I want you to follow my story until the very end. Comment what state you're watching from so I can see how far this story has traveled. At 70 years old, I thought I had seen every way a child could break their parents' heart. But standing in what I believed was my son's living room that evening, watching him laugh at my expense, I realized I was completely wrong. Let me take you back to the beginning of this story because understanding how we got to that devastating moment requires knowing the full picture of what led up to it. My relationship with my son Blake had always been complicated, but I never imagined it would end with such public humiliation and the shocking discoveries that followed. Blake is my only child, born when I was 35 years old after years of struggling with fertility issues. His father, my late husband Robert, passed away when Blake was just 16, leaving me to navigate his teenage years alone while also managing the grief of losing my partner of 20 years. Those were some of the darkest days of my life, but I was determined to give Blake every opportunity to succeed despite our circumstances. After Robert's death, I worked 2 jobs to keep Blake in his private school and maintain the lifestyle he was accustomed to. During the day, I worked as an administrative coordinator at Riverdale Medical Center, and 3 evenings a week I cleaned offices downtown. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills and allowed me to put money aside for Blake's college education. I was exhausted most of the time, but seeing my son thrive academically and socially made every sacrifice worthwhile. Blake was a bright kid, charismatic and ambitious, but he had a tendency to take shortcuts when things got difficult. In high school, I caught him cheating on several tests, and when confronted, he would always have an elaborate explanation for why it wasn't really cheating or why the teacher was being unfair. He had a way of twisting situations to make himself appear as the victim, even when he was clearly in the wrong. Despite these character flaws, I remained hopeful. I told myself that he was just young and would mature with time. When he graduated high school with decent grades, I was proud to send him to Pinewood State University with a substantial college fund that I had built through years of careful saving and those extra evening jobs. College was where Blake's patterns really began to solidify. He changed majors 3 times, spent money recklessly, and frequently called me in tears about various crises that required immediate financial assistance. A surprise textbook fee here, an unexpected dorm damage charge there, a spring break trip that he absolutely had to take for networking opportunities. Each request was presented as a one-time emergency, and each time I found myself transferring money from my savings to bail him out. Mom, I promise this is the last time. Once I graduate and get a good job, I'll pay you back for everything. You'll see, this investment in my education is going to pay off big time for both of us. I wanted to believe him so desperately. After all, what parent doesn't want to see their child succeed? And Blake was convincing. He had a way of making his requests sound reasonable, even noble. He wasn't asking for money to party or waste. He was investing in his future, our future. By the time Blake graduated with a degree in business marketing, I had spent nearly $85,000 beyond the original college fund. My retirement savings were depleted, and I had taken out a second mortgage on my small house in Oakville to cover the additional expenses. But I told myself it would all be worth it when Blake landed a great job and started his successful career. The job market, however, proved more challenging than either of us had anticipated. Blake moved back home after graduation, explaining that he needed time to find the right opportunity, rather than settling for just any entry-level position. What was supposed to be a few months stretched into 2 years of Blake living in my basement, sleeping till noon, playing video games, and half-heartedly applying for jobs that he deemed beneath his qualifications. During those 2 years, Blake's sense of entitlement seemed to grow rather than diminish. He complained about the food I bought, criticized my cooking, and treated our house like a hotel where he could come and go as he pleased without any responsibilities or contributions. When I gently suggested that he might consider taking a temporary job while looking for his ideal career position, he became defensive and angry. "Mom, you don't understand the professional world," he would say with exasperation. "If I take some dead-end retail job, it will look terrible on my resume. Employers will think I'm not serious about my career. I need to hold out for the right opportunity that matches my education and potential."
Meanwhile, my financial situation was becoming increasingly desperate.
The second mortgage payments were straining my budget, especially on my reduced income since I had scaled back to part-time work at the medical center to spend more time helping Blake with his job search. I was dipping into what remained of my savings to cover basic household expenses, but I couldn't bring myself to ask Blake to contribute. After all, he didn't have any income, and I didn't want to add pressure when he was already struggling with his job search. Finally, at age 27, Blake landed a position with Meridian Marketing Solutions as a junior marketing coordinator. The salary wasn't spectacular, but it was enough for him to live independently, and I was thrilled to see him finally launched into his adult life. He moved into a small apartment in downtown Willowbrook, about 20 minutes from my house, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could focus on rebuilding my own financial stability. But Blake's independence didn't last long. Within 6 months, he was calling me with various financial emergencies. His car needed expensive repairs. His apartment's heating bill was higher than expected. He needed professional clothes for work. A family emergency had come up for his girlfriend at the time, and he wanted to help her, but didn't have the funds. Each request came with detailed explanations and promises of quick repayment. Blake had become masterful at presenting these emergencies in a way that made refusing seem heartless. He would frame them as temporary setbacks that were preventing him from getting ahead, and if I could just help him over this one hurdle, he would be back on track. "Mom, I hate asking you for money," he would say, his voice heavy with what sounded like genuine regret. "I know you've already done so much for me, but this is different. This is an investment in my ability to become financially independent. Once I get past this rough patch, I'll never have to ask you for help again." The amounts started small, $500 here, $800 there, but they gradually increased in size and frequency. What concerned me most was that Blake never seemed to learn from these financial crises. Instead of developing better budgeting skills or building an emergency fund, he continued to live paycheck to paycheck, confident that I would always be there to bail him out when things got tight. By the time Blake turned 30, I had lent him over $40,000, in addition to everything I had already spent on his education and extended adolescence. None of it had been repaid, despite his constant promises to start making payments once his financial situation improved. When I occasionally brought up the subject of repayment, Blake would become defensive and turn the conversation around to all the sacrifices I had made as his mother, as if asking for my money back was somehow selfish and unloving. "Mom, I can't believe you're keeping track of every dollar like I'm some kind of business transaction. You're my mother. Parents help their children. That's what family is supposed to do. I didn't ask to be born, and I certainly didn't ask for Dad to die and leave us in a difficult financial situation." His ability to make me feel guilty for wanting my money back was remarkable. He had a way of reframing the conversation so that I became the unreasonable one for expecting repayment of loans rather than him being irresponsible for constantly needing bailouts. It was emotional manipulation at its finest, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. The situation reached a new level when Blake turned 32 and announced that he wanted to buy a house. By this point, he had been promoted to senior marketing coordinator and was making a decent salary, though apparently not enough to afford the type of house he wanted in Willowbrook Gardens, an upscale neighborhood known for its beautiful colonial homes and excellent schools. "Mom, this is my chance to really build wealth," he explained during a dinner at my house where he laid out his plan. "Real estate is the best investment you can make, and property values in Willowbrook Gardens have been going up every year. If I can get into a house there now, I'll build equity that will set me up for life." The problem, Blake explained, was that he didn't have enough saved for a down payment on the house he wanted. The beautiful colonial at 1247 Elmwood Drive was listed at $385,000, and he needed $77,000 for a 20% down payment to avoid mortgage insurance. He had managed to save about $25,000, but he was short by $52,000. I've been thinking about this a lot, Blake said, his tone becoming more serious. You've been paying rent in that apartment all these years, and what do you have to show for it? Nothing. But if you helped me with this down payment, we could both benefit. You could move in with me, stop throwing money away on rent, and help me with the mortgage payments. It would be like we're both investing in this property together. The proposal caught me completely off guard. Blake was suggesting that I sell my house, use the proceeds to help him buy his dream home, and then move in with him as essentially a rent-paying roommate. He presented it as a mutually beneficial arrangement, but I could see that the primary beneficiary would be Blake, who would get to live in an expensive house that he couldn't afford on his own.
I don't know, Blake, I said carefully. That's a big decision. I've lived in my house for 25 years. It's paid off and it's my security. Selling it feels like a huge risk. Blake's expression shifted, and I could see the frustration building in his eyes. Mom, you're thinking about this all wrong. Your house is tiny and outdated. You're living in the past, hanging on to something that's not even a good investment anymore. Oakville isn't growing like Willowbrook Gardens is. Your property value is basically stagnant. He pulled out his phone and started showing me real estate listings, pointing out how much more space and luxury I could have by moving in with him. The house on Elmwood Drive had 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a gourmet kitchen, and a 2-car garage. My little house in Oakville had 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and no garage. Think about it practically, Blake, he continued, his voice becoming more persuasive. You're 70 years old. How much longer do you really want to deal with maintaining a house by yourself? What happens when you need help with yard work or home repairs? At least if we're living together, I'll be there to take care of those things. The more Blake talked, the more his proposal began to sound less like a partnership and more like a takeover. He was essentially asking me to liquidate my primary asset to fund his lifestyle upgrade while framing it as him doing me a favor by allowing me to live in his house. But Blake was persistent and persuasive. Over the following weeks, he called me regularly with new arguments for why this arrangement made sense. He sent me articles about the benefits of multi-generational living. He calculated how much money I would save on utilities, maintenance, and property taxes. He even arranged for me to visit the house with him and meet the real estate agent. I have to admit, the house was beautiful. The moment I walked through the front door, I was impressed by the gleaming hardwood floors, the spacious rooms filled with natural light, and the modern kitchen with granite countertops and stainless steel appliances. The master bedroom was larger than my entire living room, and the backyard was perfectly landscaped with matured trees and flower beds. Can you imagine living here, Mom? Blake asked as we stood in the kitchen, his voice filled with excitement. No more worrying about your old furnace breaking down or your roof leaking. Everything here is modern and well-maintained. You could have the guest room as your bedroom, and we could set up the den as your personal sitting room. You'd have more space than you've ever had. The real estate agent, a polished woman named Cassandra, chimed in with her sales pitch. This is such a wonderful property for a family arrangement, she said warmly. The layout really lends itself to comfortable, multi-generational living. And Willowbrook Gardens is such a desirable neighborhood. You'd be making a very smart investment. Despite my reservations, I found myself being swept along by Blake's enthusiasm and vision. He made it sound like this arrangement would solve both of our problems. I would have a beautiful place to live without the responsibilities of home ownership, and he would be able to afford his dream house with my help. It seemed like a win-win situation, at least the way Blake presented it. The financial numbers Blake showed me seemed reasonable, at least on the surface. My house in Oakville was worth approximately $180,000. After paying off the remaining balance on my second mortgage, I would net about $165,000 from the sale. Blake was asking for $52,000 for the down payment, which would leave me with $113,000 that I could invest for my retirement. And you'll be saving at least $800 a month on housing costs, Blake added, pointing to his calculations. Even if you contribute $600 a month toward the mortgage payment, you'll still be ahead financially. Plus, you'll be building equity in a much more valuable property. After weeks of consideration, discussions with my financial advisor, and pressure from Blake, I finally agreed to his proposal. Looking back now, I can see that my decision was driven more by emotion than logic. I wanted to help my son succeed, and I was tired of him constantly struggling financially and coming to me for bailouts. This seemed like a way to solve his problems permanently while also giving me a comfortable place to live in my retirement years. The process of selling my house and helping Blake purchase his was more complicated than I had anticipated. There were inspections, appraisals, loan applications, and mountains of paperwork. Blake handled most of the details for his purchase, while I focused on preparing my house for sale and dealing with the emotional challenge of leaving the home where I had lived for over 20 years. When we finally closed on both properties in the same week, Blake was ecstatic. He threw a small celebration dinner and talked excitedly about our new adventure and how this arrangement was going to benefit both of us for years to come. I tried to share his enthusiasm, but I couldn't shake a nagging feeling that I had made a mistake. Moving into Blake's house was an adjustment that proved more difficult than either of us had anticipated. While the house was beautiful and spacious, it quickly became clear that Blake and I had very different ideas about how this living arrangement would work.
I had imagined that we would function as roommates or family members sharing a home, both contributing to household expenses, both having a say in decorating and household decisions, both treating the space as ours rather than his. Blake, however, seemed to view me more as a helpful tenant who contributed to the mortgage but didn't have any real authority over the living space. When I suggested hanging some of my artwork in the living room, Blake politely declined, saying he preferred a minimalist aesthetic. When I wanted to plant a small garden in one corner of the backyard, he explained that he was planning to hire a landscaping company to maintain the current design integrity. When I offered to cook dinner for both of us most evenings, he said he preferred to maintain his independence and would handle his own meals. It became increasingly clear that Blake wanted my financial contribution without any of the compromises that typically come with shared living arrangements. He wanted me to help pay for his dream house while he maintained complete control over how that house looked and functioned. The monthly financial arrangement also proved to be more expensive than Blake had originally projected. The mortgage payment was $1,847 per month, and Blake asked me to contribute $900, which was higher than the $600 he had initially suggested. When I questioned this increase, he explained that property taxes and homeowners insurance had been higher than expected, and that he needed my contribution to cover those additional costs as well. "Mom, we're both benefiting from this arrangement," he said when I expressed concern about the increased payment. "You're living in a much nicer house than you could afford on your own, and you don't have any of the responsibilities of home ownership. Paying a little extra is fair considering what you're getting in return." What I was getting in return, however, felt less valuable as time went on. I was living in a beautiful house, but it didn't feel like home. I was contributing nearly as much to housing costs as I had when I owned my own place, but I had no equity, no control, and no security. If Blake decided he didn't want me living there anymore, I would have nowhere to go and no house to fall back on. The social dynamics of our arrangement were also problematic. When Blake's friends visited, I often felt like an unwelcome intruder in what was supposed to be my home, too. Blake would introduce me awkwardly, never quite sure how to explain our living situation, and his friends would look at me with the kind of polite confusion reserved for unexpected elderly relatives at young people's gatherings. Blake's dating life became particularly uncomfortable. When he brought women home, I would retreat to my room to give them privacy, but I could hear them talking about the house as if it were entirely his. Blake never corrected their assumptions or explained that I was a co-investor in the property. Instead, he allowed them to believe that he was a successful young professional who had purchased this impressive house entirely through his own hard work and financial acumen.
The final straw came when Blake started dating Victoria, a 28-year-old marketing professional who worked for a competing firm. Victoria was polite to me when we crossed paths in the house, but it was clear that she viewed me as an obstacle to her relationship with Blake. She would make comments about how cramped it must feel to have a parent living in the house, and how much more romantic it would be if Blake had his own space. I began to suspect that Blake was telling Victoria a different story about our living arrangement than what was actually true. When I overheard Victoria talking to her friends on the phone about Blake's gorgeous house and his incredible financial success, it became clear that Blake was taking full credit for the property that I had helped him purchase. The situation came to a head about 18 months after we moved in together. Blake announced that he wanted to throw a housewarming party to show off his achievement to his friends and colleagues. He had been talking about this party for weeks, planning the guest list, the menu, and the timeline. He said, "I want everyone to see what I've accomplished. This house represents everything I've worked for, and I want to celebrate that with the people that matter to me." I noticed that Blake kept referring to the house as his accomplishment and his achievement, without any acknowledgement of my substantial financial contribution. When I gently reminded him that I had provided the down payment that made the purchase possible, he waved off my comment dismissively. "Mom, you helped me out, sure, but I'm the one who qualified for the mortgage, found the house, and handled all the negotiations. And I'm the one who makes the monthly payments that actually matter. Your contribution was nice, but it's not like you bought the house for me." His casual dismissal of my $52,000 contribution was breathtaking. That money represented years of savings, the equity from my longtime family home, and the security I had built over decades of careful financial planning. To Blake, it was apparently just a minor favor that barely warranted mention. As the party planning continued, it became increasingly clear that Blake viewed me as an embarrassing complication to the narrative he wanted to present to his guests. He wanted to be seen as a self-made success who had achieved home ownership through his own hard work and intelligence. Having his 70-year-old mother in the house complicated that story.
The night before the party, Blake approached me with what he called a small request. "Mom, I was hoping you might consider staying in your room during the party tomorrow night," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "It's just that I want to keep the focus on celebrating this milestone, and having you around might make things a little awkward for my guests." I stared at him in disbelief. "Awkward? Blake, this is my home too. I helped make this party possible by helping you buy this house." Blake's expression hardened. "It's really my house, Mom. You help with expenses, but your name isn't on the deed. And honestly, having my mother hovering around at a party for people my age is just weird. Can't you just watch TV in your room for one evening?" The conversation ended with Blake storming off to his bedroom, leaving me standing in the kitchen of the house I had helped purchase, being told I wasn't welcome at a party celebrating an achievement that wouldn't have been possible without my money. That's when I knew I had to attend this party, not as the hidden benefactor staying quietly in her room, but as someone who deserved recognition for her role in making Blake's success possible. I had no idea that the evening would lead to such dramatic revelations and consequences, but I was determined not to be erased from my own story. Which brings us to that devastating moment when Blake called me the old tenant who won't move out in front of all his friends, thinking he was clever and charming. He had no idea what he was about to unleash, or how dramatically his perfect evening was about to change. The evening of Blake's housewarming party arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to match the cold knot forming in my stomach. I had spent the entire day wrestling with whether to honor Blake's request that I stay hidden in my room or to assert my right to be present in the home I had helped purchase. By 6 p.m., as I heard the first guests arriving and the sounds of laughter drifting through the house, I had made my decision. I wasn't going to hide. I took extra care getting ready that evening, choosing a navy blue dress that my late husband Robert had always complimented me on, and the pearl necklace that had been my mother's. If I was going to face Blake's friends and colleagues, I wanted to look dignified and confident, not like the embarrassing elderly relative he apparently thought I was. The doorbar had been ringing steadily since 6:30 p.m., and I could hear Blake's voice growing more animated as he greeted each new arrival. Through my bedroom window, I watched expensive cars pulling into our driveway and parking along Elmwood Drive. BMWs, Audis, and Mercedes that suggested Blake's guest list was comprised of young professionals who were doing quite well for themselves financially. At exactly 7 p.m., I emerged from my room carrying the crystal vase I had originally intended as Blake's housewarming gift. The living room was already crowded with about 20 people, all holding wine glasses and admiring the house's features. The moment I appeared, the conversation seemed to pause slightly, as if guests were trying to figure out who I was and why I was there. Blake spotted me immediately, and I could see a flash of annoyance cross his face before he quickly rearranged his expression into something more socially appropriate. "Everyone, this is my mom, Evelyn, the woman who's been trying to give me advice about real estate for years, even though I clearly knew better." There was polite laughter from his guests, but I caught the subtle dig in his introduction. Even in this moment, Blake couldn't resist positioning himself as the knowledgeable one, and me as the well-meaning but misguided parent whose opinions weren't worth taking seriously. Blake was always independent, I said, with a smile, refusing to let his comment sting publicly. Even as a child, he preferred to figure things out on his own. Victoria appeared at Blake's side, looking stunning in a black cocktail dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She greeted me with the kind of polite warmth that felt calculated rather than genuine. "Mrs. Caldwell, how wonderful that you could join us," she said, air-kissing my cheek. "Blake has told me so much about you. It must be exciting to see him doing so well." "It certainly is," I replied, though I noticed she had used my maiden name rather than asking what I preferred to be called. It was a small thing, but it felt like another way of establishing distance and formality between us. As the evening progressed, I found myself moving through the party like a ghost, listening to conversations that made my blood pressure rise with each passing minute. Blake had positioned himself as the star of the evening, and he was clearly enjoying every moment of the attention and admiration. Near the kitchen island, I overheard him talking to a group of men who appeared to be colleagues from his marketing firm. "The key was patience and strategic thinking," Blake was saying, gesturing with his wine glass. "I could have rushed into buying something smaller or in a less desirable neighborhood, but I held out for exactly what I wanted. This house represents everything I've worked toward: location, quality, investment potential." One of the men, a tall guy with perfectly styled hair, whistled appreciatively. "Dude, this place must have cost a fortune. Willowbrook Gardens properties don't come cheap. You must be pulling in some serious cash at Meridian." Blake's smile was smug. "Well, I've always been good with money. I started saving for this place the day I got my first job, and I made some smart investment choices along the way. When you're disciplined about your finances and you know what you want, you can achieve pretty much anything." The casual lies Blake told rolled off his tongue so smoothly that I wondered if he had actually convinced himself they were true. There was no mention of the $52,000 down payment I had provided, no acknowledgement of the financial struggles that had required constant bailouts from his mother, no hint that this purchase had been possible only because I had liquidated my primary asset to help him. In his version of the story, Blake was a financial genius who had achieved home ownership through pure discipline and smart planning. The truth that he was still financially dependent on his 70-year-old mother didn't fit the image he wanted to project. I moved toward the living room where Victoria was holding court with a group of women who were examining the house's features with obvious envy.
Blake is just so impressive, Victoria was gushing to her friends. When I first met him, I was intimidated by how successful he was. I mean, look at this place. He bought it completely on his own. No help from family or anything. That kind of independence is so attractive. A blonde woman in designer jeans ran her hand along the marble fireplace mantel. God, I'm so jealous. My boyfriend and I are still renting that tiny apartment downtown because we can't scrape together enough for a decent down payment. How did Blake manage to save up so much money so quickly? Victoria's answer made my chest tighten with anger. He's just really smart about money. He told me he's always been disciplined about saving and investing, plus he got some bonuses at work for landing big clients. Blake said the key is prioritizing your long-term goals over short-term pleasures. I wanted to laugh at the irony. Blake, who had spent his 20s playing video games in my basement and his early 30s constantly asking me for financial bailouts, was being presented as a model of financial discipline and delayed gratification. The same man who had needed my help to buy professional clothes for his job was now being praised for his incredible money management skills. But what bothered me most was how completely I had been erased from the narrative. In Blake's version of events, this house was evidence of his hard work, his intelligence, his financial acumen. My contribution, the $52,000 that had made the purchase possible, the years of supporting him through his struggles, the sacrifice of my own financial security, simply didn't exist. I continued circulating through the party, and each conversation I overheard made the situation worse. Blake wasn't just taking credit for achievements that weren't entirely his own. He was actively lying about our living arrangement and the circumstances that had made this evening possible. Near the dining room, I heard him talking to an older couple who appeared to be neighbors. It's such a relief to finally have my own space. I've been looking forward to this independence for years. There's something really satisfying about owning your own home, you know? Having complete control over your environment and not having to answer to anyone. The woman, who had introduced herself earlier as Mrs. Patterson from next door, nodded approvingly. It's wonderful to see a young man with such initiative. So many people your age seem content to rent forever or live with roommates. You should be proud of what you've accomplished. I definitely am. This house represents everything I've worked for. When I walk through that front door each evening, I know that every square foot belongs to me because I earned it. I stood there listening to my son claim ownership of every square foot of a house that he couldn't have afforded without liquidating my life's primary asset, and I felt something fundamental shift inside me. This wasn't just about credit or recognition. This was about Blake actively denying my existence and contribution in order to maintain a false image of himself. The situation became even more surreal when I overheard Blake talking to a young man who appeared to be single and looking for dating advice. The thing about Blake is that he's at a stage in his life where he's really established. He's got his career figured out, he owns this amazing house, and he's financially secure. That's so different from guys who are still figuring things out or depending on their parents for help. She paused to take a sip of wine before continuing. I've dated guys who were still getting money from their families or living in their childhood bedrooms, and it's just not attractive. There's something really sexy about a man who's completely self-sufficient, you know? Blake has never needed anyone's help. He's always been independent and successful on his own terms. I nearly choked on my own wine. Blake was literally describing the opposite of the man she was dating. Blake had been financially dependent on his family for most of his adult life, he was currently living with his mother, and he had needed extensive financial help to purchase the house she was praising him for owning independently. But perhaps the most galling moment came when I overheard Blake talking to someone who appeared to be a potential business client. They were standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows that look out over the landscaped backyard, and Blake was clearly trying to impress this person with his success and stability.
Location is everything in real estate, Blake was saying with authority. When I was house hunting, I could have bought something cheaper in a different neighborhood, but I knew that Willowbrook Gardens was the smart long-term investment. Properties here appreciate faster than anywhere else in the metro area. The client, a distinguished-looking man in his 50s, was nodding thoughtfully. That's very astute thinking for someone your age. Most young professionals focus on monthly payments rather than long-term value. How did you develop such sophisticated investment instincts? Blake's response made my hands clench into fists. I've always been interested in wealth building and financial strategy. I spent years researching the real estate market, analyzing neighborhood trends, and saving aggressively so I could make exactly the right move at the right time. This house isn't just a place to live, it's the cornerstone of my investment portfolio. Everything about that answer was a lie. Blake hadn't researched anything. I had been the one suggesting that real estate was a good investment for years, while he dismissed my advice. He hadn't saved aggressively. He had spent years asking me for money to cover basic expenses. And he certainly hadn't made this move based on sophisticated financial analysis. He had chosen this house because it was the most expensive and impressive one he could get me to help him afford. But the client was clearly impressed. It's refreshing to meet a young entrepreneur with such a clear vision. A lot of people your age are still renting and complaining about how impossible it is to buy property in today's market. Well, it's definitely possible if you're willing to make sacrifices and stay focused on your goals, Blake replied with false modesty. I gave up a lot of short-term pleasures to make this happen, but it was worth it. Now I have a solid foundation to build from. I wanted to scream. Blake was taking credit not just for the house purchase, but for character traits he didn't possess. Discipline, sacrifice, long-term thinking, financial responsibility. He was presenting himself as a model of young adult success while completely erasing the person whose actual discipline and sacrifice had made his lifestyle possible. As the evening wore on, the lies became more elaborate and the omissions more glaring. Blake told stories about his home renovation decisions, his negotiations with the sellers, and his long-term plans for building wealth through real estate. He accepted compliments on his excellent taste in neighborhoods and his impressive financial achievement. Meanwhile, I moved through the party like a forgotten footnote to my own story. Guests were polite when they spoke to me directly, but it was clear that Blake had positioned me as simply his mother who happened to be visiting for the evening. No one asked about my role in the house purchase, my living situation, or my thoughts about Blake's success. I had been relegated to the role of proud parent, whose only function was to beam with maternal pride at her accomplished son. The breaking point came when I overheard a conversation between Victoria and another young woman near the powder room. They were talking quietly, but their voices carried in the hallway where I was standing. Honestly, I was a little worried when Blake first told me his mom lived with him. I thought it might be one of those situations where the guy is taking care of an elderly parent, you know? That's sweet and everything, but it can be complicated for a relationship. The other woman nodded understandingly. Yeah, that would definitely change the dynamic. How do you handle it? Victoria's laugh was light and dismissive. Oh, it's not like that at all. Blake's mom just rents a room from him because she can't afford her own place anymore. It's actually kind of sweet. Blake lets her live here for basically nothing because he feels sorry for her. She's on some kind of fixed income, and I think she was struggling to make ends meet in her old place. My vision literally went blurry with rage. Victoria was describing me as a charity case, a pathetic, elderly woman who couldn't afford housing and was dependent on her son's generosity for a place to live. According to her version of our arrangement, my $900 monthly contribution was play money that Blake was generous enough to accept to help me maintain my dignity, rather than a substantial portion of the actual mortgage payment that made Blake's lifestyle possible. But the final insult came in Victoria's next comment. The only awkward part is that she doesn't seem to realize she's basically just a tenant. Sometimes she acts like she has a say in decorating decisions or household choices, and Blake has to gently remind her that it's his house. I think she gets confused about her role here because Blake is so nice about letting her feel involved.
That's when I understood the full scope of what Blake had done. He hadn't just erased my financial contribution from the story, he had actively rewritten our entire relationship to cast himself as the generous benefactor and me as the confused, dependent parent who needed to be managed and humored. In Blake's version of reality, I was an elderly woman who didn't understand boundaries, who mistakenly thought I had rights and input in a house where I was merely a charitable lodger. My attempts to participate in household decisions weren't the natural behavior of someone who had co-invested in the property. They were the sad delusions of an aging woman who couldn't accept her dependent status. I realized that every disagreement we'd had about the house, every conversation about my role in the purchase, every moment when I had felt dismissed or marginalized, Blake had been telling Victoria, and probably others, that these were examples of my confusion and inappropriate expectations rather than legitimate concerns from a financial partner. The cruelest part was how perfectly this narrative served Blake's purposes. He got to be the successful homeowner, the loving son, and the patient caregiver all at once. He was responsible for everything positive about the situation, while I was responsible for anything awkward or complicated. As I stood in that hallway, listening to my son's girlfriend describe me as a charity case who didn't understand my place, I felt the last vestiges of my maternal patience finally snap. I had spent 18 months living in a house I had helped purchase while being treated like an unwelcome guest. I had watched Blake take credit for achievements that weren't possible without my sacrifice. I had accepted being marginalized and diminished in the name of family harmony. But I wasn't going to accept being described as a confused, dependent burden who should be grateful for whatever scraps of dignity my generous son was willing to throw my way. I walked back into the main party area with new determination. The conversations were still flowing, the wine was still pouring, and Blake was still holding court as the evening's conquering hero. But something had fundamentally changed in my perspective. I was no longer the proud mother trying to support her son's moment of celebration. I was a woman who had been systematically lied about and erased, and I was done being polite about it. Blake was standing near the fireplace, talking animatedly to a group of his colleagues about his investment strategy and his plans for future property acquisitions. Victoria was beside him, gazing at him with obvious adoration, completely unaware that everything she found attractive about her boyfriend was built on lies and his mother's sacrifice. The irony of the situation was almost laughable. Here was Blake surrounded by people who admired his independence and financial acumen, celebrating his success in a house he couldn't have afforded without liquidating his mother's primary asset. Here was Victoria bragging to her friends about dating a self-made man who never needed family help while living in a home that existed only because of extensive family financial support. But the bitterest irony was my own role in enabling this fiction. By agreeing to Blake's arrangement, by moving into his house, by quietly contributing to the mortgage while allowing him to take full credit for the purchase, I had become complicit in my own erasure. I had helped him create the perfect setup for claiming independent success while maintaining actual financial dependence. Every time I had bitten my tongue when Blake's friends complimented his house, every time I had stayed quiet when he told stories about his smart investment decisions, every time I had accepted being introduced as simply mom rather than as the co-investor who had made the evening possible, I had helped him build and maintain this elaborate lie. But tonight was going to be different. Tonight, I was going to stop protecting Blake from the consequences of his deception. Tonight, the people who were celebrating his independence and financial responsibility were going to learn the truth about who had actually made his success possible. I just had to wait for the right moment, the perfect opportunity to reveal the reality behind Blake's carefully constructed image. And as I watched him continue to bask in admiration for achievements that weren't entirely his own, I knew that moment was coming soon.
The foundation of lies he had built his reputation on was about to crumble, and for the first time in 18 months, I was actually looking forward to what would happen next. Blake had no idea that his perfect evening was about to become a disaster of his own making. But he was about to learn what happened when you tried to erase the person who had made your success possible. The woman he dismissed as confused about her role was about to show him exactly what her role had been and what it was about to become. The party was hitting its stride by 8:30 p.m., and Blake's confidence seemed to grow with each compliment and each glass of wine consumed by his admiring guests. I had positioned myself near the kitchen where I could observe the various conversations happening throughout the open concept living space while appearing to simply be enjoying the festivities. What I witnessed over the next hour would have been comical if it weren't so personally devastating. Blake had essentially turned his housewarming party into a one-man show about his fictional journey to homeownership success. He moved from group to group like a politician working a campaign event, sharing carefully crafted anecdotes that painted him as a financial mastermind who had achieved the American dream through pure determination and intelligence.
Near the sliding glass doors that led to the backyard patio, Blake was entertaining a couple who had introduced themselves as Derek and Amanda Thornton, neighbors from 3 houses down. They appeared to be in their early 40s, successful professionals who were clearly impressed by Blake's apparent achievement at such a young age. The thing that really sealed the deal for me on this property, Blake was explaining with the confidence of someone who had never actually negotiated a real estate purchase, was recognizing the long-term potential that other buyers were missing. Everyone else was looking at the current market value, but I could see where this neighborhood was heading in 5 to 10 years. Derek nodded thoughtfully, swirling his wine glass. That's incredibly sophisticated thinking. Most people our age are still learning those kinds of market analysis skills, let alone someone in their 30s. What made you so confident in your projections? Blake's answer was so smoothly delivered that I wondered if he had rehearsed it. I spent about 2 years studying comparable sales data, analyzing demographic trends, and tracking infrastructure development plans for the city. I also looked at the school district ratings and projected population growth patterns. When you put all that data together, it was clear that Willowbrook Gardens was undervalued relative to its potential. Amanda looked genuinely impressed. Wow! That's the kind of research I would expect from a professional real estate investor, not someone buying their first home. Where did you learn to do that kind of analysis? I've always been interested in economics and investment strategy, Blake replied with false modesty. I read a lot of financial publications, took some online courses in my spare time, and really made it a priority to educate myself before making such a significant purchase. I wanted to laugh out loud. Blake's research had consisted of me suggesting that real estate was a good investment, while he spent his evenings playing video games and complaining about having to look at houses in neighborhoods he couldn't afford. But the Thorntons were eating it up. Derek pulled out his phone and asked Blake to recommend some of the financial publications he had found most helpful. Amanda wanted to know about the online courses he had mentioned. They were treating Blake like a mentor who could help them make smarter investment decisions for their own family. I'd love to pick your brain sometime about some investment opportunities I've been considering, Derek said, clearly hoping to establish an ongoing relationship with this apparent financial genius. It's not often you meet someone who combines that kind of analytical thinking with the courage to act on their convictions. Blake graciously agreed to a future coffee meeting, positioning himself as someone whose insights were valuable enough to seek out. Meanwhile, I stood 15 feet away, the actual person who had made his courageous investment possible, completely invisible to everyone in the conversation. The lies became even more elaborate when Blake started talking to a group of younger professionals who appeared to be struggling with their own housing situations. A woman named Jessica mentioned that she and her husband were trying to save for a down payment but finding it impossible with student loan payments and rising rent costs. I totally understand that challenge, Blake said, with sympathetic authority. The key is making strategic sacrifices and really prioritizing your long-term goals over short-term gratification. I lived extremely frugally for about 5 years, basically putting every extra dollar toward my house fund. Connor shook his head in admiration. 5 years of extreme frugality?
Man, that takes serious discipline. What kind of sacrifices are we talking about? Blake launched into a detailed description of the sacrifices he had supposedly made to achieve homeownership. According to his version of events, he had lived in a tiny studio apartment, eaten ramen noodles for dinner most nights, never taken vacations, avoided expensive hobbies, and turned down countless social invitations in order to save money. I basically lived like a monk for 5 years, Blake said with a self-deprecating laugh. My friends thought I was crazy, but I knew what I wanted and I was willing to do whatever it took to get there. When you're really committed to a goal, you find ways to cut expenses that other people wouldn't even consider. Jessica looked both impressed and intimidated. That's incredible commitment. I don't know if I could be that disciplined. What kept you motivated during the really tough times? I kept a picture of my dream house on my refrigerator, Blake replied, his voice taking on an inspirational tone. Every time I was tempted to spend money on something unnecessary, I would look at that picture and remind myself what I was working toward. I also tracked my savings progress obsessively. I had spreadsheets showing exactly how each dollar saved was bringing me closer to my goal. The group was hanging on his every word, treating Blake like a motivational speaker who had discovered the secret to achieving impossible dreams through sheer willpower. Connor asked for specific tips about budgeting apps. Jessica wanted to know about Blake's spreadsheet system. Another woman asked about strategies for resisting spending temptations. I listened to this fictional account of Blake's path to homeownership with a mixture of rage and disbelief. The man who was describing 5 years of monk-like frugality had actually spent those years living in my basement, eating food I purchased, asking me for money to cover basic expenses, and complaining that entry-level jobs were beneath his qualifications.
The tiny studio apartment he claimed to have sacrificed in was actually my comfortable guest bedroom, which he had occupied rent-free while I worked extra hours to support both of us. The ramen noodle dinners were actually home-cooked meals I had prepared while he focused on his job search. The extreme sacrifices were actually sacrifices I had made to enable his extended adolescence. But perhaps most galling was Blake's claim about tracking his savings progress with obsessive spreadsheets. The only financial tracking that had happened during those years was me monitoring my dwindling retirement savings as I repeatedly bailed him out of various financial crises. Yet here he was, presenting himself as a model of financial discipline and delayed gratification to young people who were actually working multiple jobs and making real sacrifices to achieve their goals. He was literally giving advice based on achievements he had never accomplished and discipline he had never demonstrated. The performance reached new heights of absurdity when Blake started talking to a couple who were clearly struggling with their own family financial dynamics. The woman, who introduced herself as Melissa, mentioned that her parents had offered to help with a down payment, but she and her husband weren't sure whether to accept family financial assistance. "That's a really personal decision," Blake said, with the wisdom of someone who had supposedly never faced such a dilemma. "I can definitely see both sides of that situation. There's something really satisfying about achieving home ownership completely on your own, knowing that every dollar came from your own hard work and sacrifice." Melissa's husband, Ryan, looked conflicted. "We appreciate the offer from Melissa's parents, but we're worried about the strings that might come attached. We've seen other couples where family financial help created ongoing tensions and complications." Blake nodded sagely. "That's a very mature perspective. Family money can definitely create complex dynamics, even when everyone has good intentions. I personally chose to go the completely independent route because I wanted to know that this achievement was entirely mine." He gestured around the room with obvious pride. "Every square foot of this house represents my own work, my own decisions, my own financial discipline. There's a confidence that comes from knowing you didn't need anyone else's help to achieve your goals." Melissa seemed genuinely torn. "It would definitely take us longer to save up the full down payment ourselves, Maybe another 3 or 4 years. But you're right. There is something appealing about being able to say we did it completely on our own. The waiting is definitely hard, Blake acknowledged. But trust me, the satisfaction of walking into a house that you purchased entirely through your own effort is worth every extra month of saving. Plus, you learn so much about financial discipline and goal setting during that process that will serve you well throughout your life. I wanted to grab Melissa and Ryan and shake them. Here was Blake giving advice about the satisfaction of independent achievement while standing in a house he couldn't have afforded without massive family financial assistance, talking to a couple who were actually considering turning down family help in order to achieve the kind of independence Blake was falsely claiming to have achieved himself. The cruel irony was that Blake's advice would likely result in Melissa and Ryan struggling for several additional years to save money and potentially missing out on property appreciation, all in pursuit of an ideal of financial independence that Blake himself had never actually practiced. But the conversation that finally pushed me over the edge happened around 9:15 p.m., when Blake found himself talking to an older gentleman who had introduced himself as Mr. Hendricks, a retired financial advisor who lived in the neighborhood. Mr. Hendricks had been asking thoughtful questions about Blake's investment strategy, and I could see that Blake was enjoying the opportunity to impress someone with actual financial expertise. "You know," Mr. Hendricks said thoughtfully, "I've been helping people with financial planning for over 30 years, and I can tell you that what you've accomplished is genuinely unusual for someone your age. Most young professionals I meet are struggling with student debt, credit card balances, and the challenge of saving anything significant while dealing with entry-level salaries." Blake's chest visibly puffed with pride. "I definitely feel fortunate to have figured out the discipline part early. I think a lot of people my age get caught up in lifestyle inflation and immediate gratification instead of thinking long-term." "Exactly," Mr. Hendricks agreed. "The ability to delay gratification and make systematic sacrifices for future goals is really what separates people who build wealth from people who just get by paycheck to paycheck." Did you have any mentors or influences that helped you develop that mindset? This was Blake's moment to acknowledge the actual source of his financial education, the mother who had modeled financial responsibility, worked multiple jobs to support him, and ultimately made his homeownership possible through her own sacrifices. Instead, he doubled down on the fiction of his self-made success. "I think it really came from watching my peers make financial mistakes and determining that I didn't want to follow that path. I saw friends taking on unnecessary debt, spending money on expensive cars and vacations they couldn't afford, and basically living for today without thinking about tomorrow." Mr. Hendricks nodded approvingly. "That kind of self-awareness is rare. Most people have to learn those lessons through painful experience rather than observation. I've always been pretty analytical by nature. When I decided I wanted to own a home, I treated it like a business problem to be solved. I calculated exactly how much I needed to save, figured out what sacrifices would be required, and then executed that plan systematically over several years."
The retired financial advisor was clearly impressed. "That's exactly the kind of systematic approach I try to teach my clients. The fact that you figured that out on your own, without professional guidance, is really remarkable." Blake's false modesty was sickening. "I definitely made some mistakes along the way, but I tried to learn from each one and stay focused on the bigger picture. The hardest part was probably maintaining motivation during the times when it felt like the goal was impossibly far away." "What kept you going during those difficult periods?" Mr. Hendricks asked, genuinely curious about Blake's supposed journey to financial success. "I think it was really about clarity of vision," Blake replied, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing hard-won wisdom. "I knew exactly what I wanted, not just a house, but the financial security and independence that home ownership represents. When you're really clear about your goals and committed to achieving them, you find reserves of discipline you didn't know you had." Mr. Hendricks was practically glowing with approval. "Young man, You should seriously consider a career in financial planning. You have the kind of mindset and discipline that could help a lot of people achieve their goals." Blake laughed as if the suggestion was flattering but unnecessary. I definitely made some mistakes along the way, but I tried to learn from each one and stay focused on the bigger picture. The hardest part was probably maintaining motivation during the times when it felt like the goal was impossibly far away. "What kept you going during those difficult periods?" Mr. Hendricks asked, genuinely curious about Blake's supposed journey to financial success. "I think it was really about clarity of vision," Blake replied, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing hard-won wisdom. "I knew exactly what I wanted, not just a house, but the financial security and independence that home ownership represents. When you're really clear about your goals and committed to achieving them, you find reserves of discipline you didn't know you had." Blake's false modesty was sickening. I definitely made some mistakes along the way, but I tried to learn from each one and stay focused on the bigger picture. The hardest part was probably maintaining motivation during the times when it felt like the goal was impossibly far away. "What kept you going during those difficult periods?" Mr. Hendricks asked, genuinely curious about Blake's supposed journey to financial success. "I think it was really about clarity of vision," Blake replied, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing hard-won wisdom. "I knew exactly what I wanted, not just a house, but the financial security and independence that home ownership represents. When you're really clear about your goals and committed to achieving them, you find reserves of discipline you didn't know you had." Mr. Hendricks was practically glowing with approval. "Young man, you should seriously consider a career in financial planning. You have the kind of mindset and discipline that could help a lot of people achieve their goals." Blake laughed as if the suggestion was flattering but unnecessary. "I appreciate that, but I'm really happy with my marketing career. Although I do think everyone should take responsibility for their own financial education, too many people expect others to solve their money problems instead of developing the discipline to solve them themselves." That final comment was what broke my last thread of self-control. Blake, who had spent most of his adult life expecting me to solve his money problems, was lecturing about the importance of financial self-reliance while standing in a house purchased with my life savings. The man who needed constant bailouts was positioning himself as an expert on financial discipline. The son who had liquidated his mother's primary asset was giving advice about the satisfaction of independent achievement. The person who had never actually demonstrated the ability to save money systematically was being praised for his remarkable financial planning skills. As I stood there listening to Blake accept congratulations for character traits he didn't possess and achievements he hadn't earned, I realized that this wasn't just about tonight's lies. This was about Blake's fundamental approach to life, taking credit for successes he hadn't created while avoiding responsibility for the help he had received. He had convinced himself that his story was true, that he really was the self-made financial success his guests believed him to be. In Blake's mind, my contribution had been so minor and my ongoing support so expected that he had literally rewritten history to erase my role entirely. But the most infuriating part was how much he was enjoying the admiration and respect he was receiving for my sacrifices. Every compliment about his discipline was a compliment that should have been directed at me. Every expression of amazement at his achievement was amazement at something I had made possible. Every word of praise for his financial wisdom was praise for decisions I had influenced and contributions I had made. Blake wasn't just stealing credit for the house purchase, he was stealing recognition for the character traits and life choices that had actually been demonstrated by his mother. He was basking in admiration for qualities he had never developed, while the person who had actually demonstrated those qualities stood invisible in the background. The party continued around me, but I was no longer really present. I was consumed by a cold fury that went beyond anything I had felt in my 70 years of life. My son hadn't just disappointed me or hurt my feelings, He had systematically erased my existence and stolen my identity to create a false image of himself. Every conversation I had overheard was another piece of evidence that Blake had not only taken my money, but had convinced himself and others that he deserved all the credit for achievements that were actually mine. He had turned my generosity into proof of his independence, my sacrifices into evidence of his discipline, and my financial contributions into validation of his success. As I watched Blake continue to work the room, accepting congratulations and offering advice based on experiences he had never had, I knew that something fundamental had changed in our relationship. I was no longer his mother trying to support his success. I was a victim of fraud who had just discovered the full extent of the deception. The evening was far from over, but Blake's performance had already given me everything I needed to understand who my son really was and what our relationship had actually become. The question now was what I was going to do with that knowledge. Blake thought he was the star of the evening, the successful host, celebrating his achievement with friends and colleagues who admired his independence and financial acumen. He had no idea that he was actually performing for an audience that included the one person who knew every word of his story was a lie. And as I stood there, watching him bask in fraudulent glory, I began to plan exactly how the rest of this evening was going to unfold. Blake wanted to be seen as a self-made success who had achieved everything through his own merit. It was time for him to learn what happened when the person who had actually made his success possible decided to stop being invisible. The foundation of lies he had built his reputation on was about to meet the truth he had been so eager to erase. And for the first time since arriving at the party, I found myself genuinely excited about what was going to happen next.
By 9:45 p.m., the party had reached that comfortable peak where everyone was relaxed, conversations were flowing freely, and Blake was riding high on the waves of admiration from his guests. The wine had loosened tongues and lowered inhibitions, which meant that the compliments about Blake's success were becoming more effusive and his responses were becoming more elaborate. I had spent the last hour moving through different groups, listening to Blake's increasingly outrageous claims about his path to home ownership, but now I found myself gravitating toward the center of the action. Something inside me had shifted during that conversation with Mr. Hendricks, and I was no longer content to observe from the sidelines. The invisible woman who had been quietly enabling Blake's fiction was about to step into the spotlight. Blake had positioned himself in the living room's central seating area, where a group of about 8 people had gathered around him like disciples listening to a financial guru. Victoria was curled up beside him on the couch, gazing at him with obvious adoration as he held court. The coffee table in front of them was covered with wine glasses, appetizer plates, and the kind of relaxed intimacy that comes when a party has found its perfect rhythm. "You know what I think the real secret is?" Blake was saying, his voice carrying that slightly amplified quality that comes with confidence and wine, is having the courage to bet on yourself when everyone else thinks you're crazy. A woman named Sarah, who worked in Blake's marketing department, leaned forward with interest. "What do you mean by that?" Blake gestured expansively around the room. "When I told people I was planning to buy a house in Willowbrook Gardens, everyone said I was dreaming too big. They said I should start with something smaller, something more realistic for someone my age. But I knew what I wanted, and I was willing to do whatever it took to get it." The group murmured appreciatively, and I noticed several people nodding as if Blake was sharing profound wisdom rather than complete fabrications. "That's so inspiring," said a young man named Kevin, who appeared to be fresh out of college. "I'm just starting my career, and sometimes it feels impossible to think about buying property. Everything seems so expensive." Blake's response was delivered with the authority of someone who had supposedly overcome those exact challenges through sheer determination. The key is thinking differently about what's possible. Most people look at their current income and current savings and decide what they can't afford. I looked at what I wanted and figured out how to make it affordable.
Victoria squeezed Blake's arm affectionately. That's exactly what attracted me to Blake when we first met. He doesn't accept limitations, he finds solutions. It's really about mindset, Blake continued, clearly enjoying being the center of attention. Poor people think about what they can't afford. Rich people think about how to afford what they want. The difference isn't income, it's approach. Kevin pulled out his phone to take notes, treating Blake's pronouncements like valuable life lessons. Can you give us some specific examples of how you made this place affordable when it seemed impossible? This was the moment I had been unconsciously waiting for, the moment when Blake would have to get specific about his supposed financial strategies. I moved closer to the group, positioning myself where I could hear every word while remaining just outside the main circle of conversation. Blake leaned back with the confidence of someone who had told this story so many times he had convinced himself it was true. Well, the first thing I did was completely restructure my lifestyle around this goal. I calculated exactly how much I needed to save each month to make the purchase possible within my timeline, and then I engineered my entire life around hitting those numbers. Sarah looked impressed. That sounds incredibly disciplined. What kind of lifestyle changes are we talking about? Everything, Blake said dramatically. I moved into the cheapest housing I could find, basically a tiny room that was barely livable. I ate the same cheap meals every day, pasta, rice, beans, whatever was on sale. I didn't go out, I didn't travel, I didn't buy clothes unless something literally fell apart. The group was hanging on his every word, and I could see Kevin frantically typing notes into his phone. Meanwhile, I was listening to Blake describe living in my comfortable guest bedroom and eating my home-cooked meals as if he had been surviving in a slum on bread and water. The social sacrifices were probably the hardest part, Blake continued with a slight tremor in his voice, as if he was sharing something genuinely painful. My friends would invite me out for dinner or weekend trips, and I'd have to say no over and over again. People started thinking I was antisocial or cheap, but I kept my eye on the bigger picture. Victoria's expression was sympathetic, as if she was hearing about these sacrifices for the first time and feeling proud of Blake's dedication. That must have been so isolating, she said softly. It was, Blake agreed, his voice taking on a slightly heroic tone. There were definitely times when I questioned whether it was worth it. Sitting alone in my tiny room, eating ramen noodles for the third night in a row, watching other people my age living it up on social media. Yeah, I had moments of doubt. A woman named Lisa, who appeared to be in her late 20s, shook her head in amazement. I can't imagine having that kind of willpower. How did you stay motivated through the really tough times?
Blake's answer was delivered with the gravity of someone sharing hard-won wisdom. I kept a vision board above my bed with pictures of houses like this one. Every morning when I woke up and every night before I went to sleep, I would look at those images and remind myself why I was making these sacrifices. This was getting more absurd by the minute. Blake had never created a vision board, never lived in a tiny room, and certainly never eaten ramen noodles for dinner while I was cooking actual meals downstairs. But his audience was completely captivated by this fictional tale of heroic self-denial. The really crucial moment, Blake continued, came about 2 years into the saving process when I had the opportunity to move into a nicer place. My landlord was offering me a much better apartment for only a little more money, and honestly, I was tempted. I was so tired of living in that cramped space. Kevin looked up from his phone. What did you decide? I stayed, Blake said with quiet pride. I realized that the temporary comfort wasn't worth jeopardizing my long-term goal. That decision probably saved me an extra $300 a month, which over the remaining time period added up to thousands of dollars toward my down payment. I nearly laughed out loud. The better apartment Blake was referring to was my suggestion that he might want to get his own place when he turned 30, which he had rejected because he preferred living rent-free in my house. But the most infuriating part was watching Blake's audience react to these lies as if they were receiving valuable life lessons from a successful mentor.
Kevin was typing detailed notes. Sarah was asking follow-up questions about budgeting strategies. Lisa wanted to know about Blake's investment approach for the money he had saved. The investment piece was really important, Blake explained with authority. I didn't just stick the money in a regular savings account earning nothing. I researched high-yield options, CD ladders, even some conservative mutual funds to make sure my down payment fund was growing as efficiently as possible. This was completely fictional. Blake had never had enough money to invest, and his understanding of financial instruments was limited to knowing that his debit card stopped working when his checking account was empty. But he was describing complex investment strategies as if he had been managing a sophisticated portfolio for years. "What kind of returns were you getting?" asked a man named Marcus, who had joined the conversation midway through. Blake paused for just a moment, as if calculating, then delivered his answer with confident precision. "I was averaging about 4.2% annually on the conservative investments, with some of the higher risk portions hitting closer to 7%. The key was balancing growth potential with the security of knowing I'd have the money when I needed it." Marcus nodded approvingly. "That's a really smart approach. A lot of people either play it too safe and earn nothing, or they take too much risk and potentially lose money they can't afford to lose." "Exactly," Blake agreed. "The whole strategy was about calculated risks and staying disciplined about the timeline. I knew X amount of money by Y date, so I reverse engineered the whole plan from that endpoint." Victoria was looking at Blake with obvious pride and admiration. "I had no idea you were so sophisticated about investing. You make it sound so strategic and professional." "Well, when you're serious about a goal, you learn what you need to learn," Blake said with false modesty. "I probably read 50 books about real estate investing, personal finance, and wealth building during those years. Knowledge was just as important as saving money." Sarah leaned forward eagerly. "Can you recommend some of those books? I'd love to start educating myself about this stuff." Blake launched into a list of financial self-help books that I recognized as titles I had mentioned to him over the years when I was trying to encourage him to take more responsibility for his finances. He presented them as books that had been crucial to his education and success, when in reality, he had dismissed most of my suggestions as unnecessary or boring. "The one that really changed my mindset," Blake said, "was Rich Dad, Poor Dad. It made me realize that the difference between people who build wealth and people who stay broke isn't income. It's financial education and mindset." Kevin was typing furiously. "What was the biggest lesson you took from that book?" "The idea that your house isn't really an asset if you're living in it. It's only an asset if it's generating income. So even though I'm living here now, I designed the purchase with the long-term strategy of eventually turning this into rental income while I upgrade to something even better." This was news to me. Blake had never mentioned any strategy about rental income or upgrading to better properties. This appeared to be another fictional element he was adding to make his story sound more sophisticated and forward-thinking. But his audience was completely captivated by this fictional tale of heroic self-denial. Lisa asked about his timeline for the rental conversion. Marcus wanted to know about property management strategies. Kevin inquired about the tax implications of rental income. Blake answered every question with the confidence of someone who had actually implemented these strategies rather than someone who was making them up on the spot. He discussed cash flow analysis, tenant screening processes, and property appreciation calculations as if he had years of real estate investment experience. The conversation was interrupted when Victoria's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and then looked up with excitement. "Oh my God, Blake, Jenny just texted me back about the house tour." Blake looked confused for a moment. "What house tour?"
"Remember? I told Jenny from work about your amazing house, and she asked if she could bring her boyfriend to see it sometime. They're house hunting and looking for inspiration." Victoria was practically bouncing with enthusiasm. She said they could come by next weekend if that works. The group's attention shifted to this new development, with several people expressing interest in bringing their own friends or partners to see Blake's house. Sarah mentioned that her sister was also house hunting. Kevin asked if Blake would be willing to share advice with his girlfriend who was trying to save for a down payment. "I'd be happy to help," Blake said graciously, clearly enjoying his new role as the neighborhood's home ownership success story. I learned so much during this process, and I'm always glad to share what I know with people who are serious about achieving similar goals. This was the moment when something inside me finally snapped completely. Blake wasn't just lying about his past achievements, he was positioning himself as an ongoing mentor and advisor for other people's financial decisions. He was preparing to give advice about homeownership, saving strategies, and investment approaches to people who were actually working hard and making real sacrifices to achieve their goals. The young people surrounding Blake were looking at him with genuine respect and admiration, treating him as a role model whose guidance could help them achieve their own dreams. They had no idea they were receiving advice from someone whose only real expertise was in convincing his mother to fund his lifestyle. But what pushed me over the edge was the realization that Blake was planning to continue this performance indefinitely. This wasn't just about tonight's lies. This was about Blake building an entire identity around achievements he hadn't earned and wisdom he didn't possess. He was going to invite other people's friends to tour his house. He was going to give financial advice based on strategies he had never implemented. He was going to present himself as a successful real estate investor while living off his mother's sacrifices. I began walking toward the group with purpose, no longer caring about remaining invisible or protecting Blake's moment of glory. The woman who had been quietly enabling this elaborate fiction was about to step into the spotlight and set the record straight. As I approached, Blake noticed me and his expression shifted slightly. Perhaps he sensed that something had changed in my demeanor, or maybe he was just surprised to see me actively joining the conversation after spending most of the evening on the periphery. "Oh, here's my mom," Blake said to the group, his tone carrying that familiar note of condescension. "Mom, we were just talking about real estate investing strategies. I was sharing some of the lessons I learned during my home buying process." The group turned to look at me with polite interest, clearly expecting the proud mother to beam with admiration for her successful son's wisdom and achievements. Instead, I looked directly at Blake and said in a voice that was calm, but somehow managed to cut through all the ambient party noise. "What lessons were those, Blake? The lesson about how to convince your mother to liquidate her house so you could afford a down payment? Or the lesson about how to take credit for someone else's sacrifices?" The silence that followed was immediate and absolute. 8 people who had been engaged in animated conversation suddenly became completely still, their wine glasses frozen halfway to their lips, and their expressions shifting from casual interest to acute discomfort. Blake's face went through a series of rapid changes. Confusion, then recognition of what was happening, then something that looked like panic. "Mom, what are you talking about? I think you might be confused." "I'm not confused, Blake," I interrupted, my voice growing stronger. "What I'm confused about is how you managed to convince all these lovely people that you saved up for this house through years of disciplined budgeting and smart investing, when the truth is that you couldn't have afforded the down payment without the $52,000 I gave you from selling my house." Victoria's mouth literally fell open. Kevin had stopped typing and was staring at Blake with wide eyes. Sarah looked like she was watching a car accident unfold in slow motion. Blake's voice became desperate and angry. "Mom, you're embarrassing yourself. You're obviously having some kind of episode." "The only episode I'm having," I said, my voice now carrying the authority of someone who had finally decided to stop being polite, "is an episode of clarity about exactly who is living in this house and who actually made it possible." I turned to address Blake's audience directly. "Did Blake tell you about the vision board he kept above his bed? Because he was sleeping in my guest bedroom, rent-free, for 2 years while I worked extra hours to pay the bills. Did he mention the tiny room where he ate ramen noodles? Because I was cooking dinner for him every night in my kitchen." The group was staring at me in stunned silence, then looking at Blake for some kind of explanation or denial. But Blake's face had gone completely white, and for the first time all evening, he seemed to be at a loss for words. "And those investment strategies he was describing so expertly?
Blake has never invested $1 in his life. The only financial strategy he's ever mastered is asking his mother for money when he runs out. That's when Blake finally found his voice. And when he spoke, his words revealed everything about how he really saw our relationship. "Look, everyone," Blake said with a forced laugh that didn't quite hide his panic. "My mom is getting a little confused about her role here. She's essentially just a tenant who helps with some of the household expenses. Sometimes elderly people get confused about boundaries and ownership and things like that." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Blake had just called me a confused elderly tenant in front of 8 people who had been admiring his supposed independence and financial acumen. But then he said the words that would change everything between us forever. "I mean, she's basically just the old tenant who won't move out." Blake laughed again, looking around the group as if expecting them to join in his amusement at his confused mother's inappropriate outburst. Instead, he was met with horrified silence and expressions ranging from shock to disgust. Because Blake had just made the fatal mistake of publicly humiliating the person who actually owned the moral high ground in this situation. And as I stood there looking at my son, this man who had just dismissed me as a confused old tenant in front of strangers, I realized that our relationship as mother and son was over. What happened next was going to be about justice, not family. The silence that followed Blake's old tenant comment stretched for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 seconds. In that moment, I could see the wheels turning in the minds of his guests as they processed what they had just witnessed. A successful young man publicly humiliating his elderly mother by dismissing her as a confused tenant. But Blake had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He thought that calling me names and dismissing my claims would make me retreat in embarrassment, allowing him to smooth over the situation and return to his performance. Instead, his cruel words had just freed me from any remaining obligation to protect his feelings or preserve our relationship. I looked around the circle of shocked faces, then back at Blake, and smiled with a calmness that seemed to unnerve him more than anger would have. "A confused old tenant," I repeated thoughtfully. "That's interesting, Blake. Let me help clear up some of that confusion for everyone." I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, opening the Photos app with deliberate precision. The first image I displayed to the group was a picture of the real estate closing documents from 18 months ago. "This is the settlement statement from the purchase of this house," I announced, holding the phone so everyone could see. "You'll notice that the down payment of $52,000 came from the proceeds of selling my house at 1847 Maple Street in Oakville. That's my signature authorizing the wire transfer." Victoria leaned forward to look at the document, her expression shifting from confusion to something approaching horror. "Blake," she said quietly, "what is this?" Blake's voice cracked slightly as he tried to maintain his composure. "Mom, this is completely inappropriate. You can't just—" "Oh, but I can," I interrupted, swiping to the next photo. "This is the mortgage application that Blake filled out. Notice how his annual income of $67,000 wasn't nearly enough to qualify for the loan amount he needed. The only reason the bank approved this mortgage was because I signed as a co-borrower, using my credit score and financial history." Kevin, who had been taking notes throughout Blake's financial advice session, stared at the document with obvious confusion. "So you co-signed for the mortgage?" "Not just co-signed," I clarified, swiping to another document. "According to the legal paperwork, I'm listed as a co-owner of this property. My name is on the deed right alongside Blake's, which makes sense since I provided the entire down payment and I'm responsible for half the mortgage payments." The group turned to look at Blake, expecting him to provide some explanation for why he had spent the entire evening claiming to be the sole owner of a house that was legally half-owned by his mother. Blake's face had gone from a white to red to a sort of grayish color that suggested he was having trouble breathing.
This is insane, Blake said, his voice rising with desperation. You're completely misrepresenting the situation. Yes, you helped me out with some of the initial costs, but this is my house. I'm the one making the payments. I'm the one who qualified for the mortgage. Actually, I said, pulling up my banking app on my phone, let me show everyone exactly who's making the payments. I displayed my bank statement, scrolling to show the recurring monthly transfer of $1,847 to Blake's account, the exact amount of the mortgage payment. Every month for the past 18 months, I've been transferring the full mortgage payment to Blake's account. He then writes a check to the bank as if the money came from him. Sarah's mouth was hanging open. So you're paying the entire mortgage? The mortgage, the property taxes, the homeowner's insurance, and the HOA fees, I confirmed. Blake contributes exactly $0 toward the actual ownership costs of this house. Marcus, who had been nodding appreciatively at Blake's investment advice just minutes earlier, looked sick. Then what does Blake pay for? His car payment, his credit card bills, his entertainment expenses, and his dates with Victoria, I replied matter-of-factly. Essentially, I'm subsidizing Blake's entire lifestyle by covering all his housing costs so he can spend his salary on everything else.
Victoria turned to stare at Blake with an expression of complete bewilderment. Blake, is this true? Has your mother been paying for everything this whole time? Blake's response was to double down on his aggression toward me. She's exaggerating everything to make herself seem important. Yes, she helps with some expenses, but that doesn't give her the right to embarrass me in front of my friends and colleagues. Some expenses? I laughed, and the sound was sharp enough to make several people flinch. Blake, shall I show them the receipts for the new refrigerator, the landscaping service, the roof repairs, and the HVAC maintenance? Because I have all of those, too. I began swiping through a folder on my phone labeled House Expenses, displaying invoice after invoice showing payments I had made for home maintenance, improvements, and utilities. Each document showed my name as the payer and this address as the service location. The confused old tenant, I said conversationally, has apparently been paying for every single expense related to maintaining this property, while the supposed owner has been spending his money on designer clothes and expensive restaurants. Kevin looked like he was watching his entire worldview collapse. So, when you were giving us advice about financial discipline and sacrifice, he was describing sacrifices I made. The years of living frugally, that was me working 2 jobs to support Blake while he lived in my house rent-free. The strategic saving plan, that was me building up the money to make this purchase possible. The investment knowledge, those were books I recommended to him that he never actually read. Lisa had gone very quiet, but now she spoke up with obvious anger in her voice. You mean everything you told us about your path to home ownership was completely made up? Blake tried one more desperate deflection. Look, this is a private family matter that my mother is inappropriately making public. Even if she helped with some of the financial aspects, that doesn't change the fact that this is my house and my achievement. That's when I decided to show them the most damning evidence of all. I opened my text messages and found the conversation thread with Blake from 3 weeks earlier. Let me read you a few messages from Blake, sent when he thought he was talking privately to his personal ATM. I cleared my throat and began reading aloud. Mom, I need another $3,000 for the mortgage payment this month. I had some unexpected expenses and can't cover it. The group was staring at Blake in stunned silence as I continued reading. And here's Blake's response when I suggested he might need to budget more carefully. Mom, stop trying to micromanage my finances. You knew what you were signing up for when you agreed to help me buy this place. I can't build wealth if you're going to question every expense. Victoria's face had gone completely pale. Blake, you told me you own this house outright. You said you had paid off the mortgage early because of your financial discipline. I never said that, Blake protested weakly. Yes, you did, Victoria replied with growing anger. You specifically said that one of the advantages of dating you was that you were financially stable and didn't have debt, like other guys our age. I swiped to another text message. Here's another interesting one from last month. Mom, I'm thinking about proposing to Victoria soon. Can you increase the monthly transfer by $500 so I can afford a nice ring without it impacting my other expenses? Victoria's wine glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the coffee table, red wine spreading across the white surface like blood. You were going to use your mother's money to buy my engagement ring? Blake was now completely panicked, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape route. Victoria, you don't understand the context of these messages. The context is that Blake has been pretending to be financially independent while actually being supported by his mother in every possible way. The man who was just giving advice about wealth building and financial discipline is essentially a 35-year-old child whose mother pays all his bills. Mr. Hendricks, the retired financial advisor, who had been so impressed with Blake's supposed expertise, spoke up for the first time since my revelations began. Young man, are you telling me that everything you said about your investment strategies and financial planning was fabricated? Blake tried to salvage some credibility. I was describing principles that I believe in and strategies that I'm planning to implement. You were lying, Mr. Hendricks said flatly. You are giving financial advice based on experiences you've never had and discipline you've never demonstrated. Do you understand how dangerous that could be for these young people who might actually follow your suggestions? The weight of that observation settled over the group like a dark cloud. Blake hadn't just been bragging or exaggerating, he had been positioning himself as a mentor whose advice could influence other people's major financial decisions. Kevin looked like he was watching his entire worldview collapse. So when you were giving us advice about financial discipline and sacrifice, he was describing sacrifices I made. The years of living frugally, that was me working 2 jobs to support Blake while he lived in my house rent-free. The strategic saving plan, that was me building up the money to make this purchase possible. The investment knowledge, those were books I recommended to him that he never actually read. Blake's carefully constructed evening was collapsing in real time, but he made one final attempt to regain control of the narrative. Standing up abruptly, he pointed an accusing finger at me and raised his voice so the entire party could hear.
You know what this is really about? He announced to the room. This is about a bitter old woman who can't accept that her son has outgrown her. She's jealous of my success and my relationship with Victoria, so she's trying to sabotage my life by making everything about her contributions. The silence that followed was deafening. Blake had just called his 70-year-old mother a bitter, jealous woman in front of 30 people, after she had provided evidence that she was financially supporting his entire lifestyle. But I wasn't finished yet. Blake, I said quietly, since you want to make this public, let's make it completely public. I pulled up one more document on my phone, a legal letter I had prepared but hadn't planned to use unless absolutely necessary. This is a formal notice from my attorney regarding the property ownership situation, I announced to the room. According to the legal documents, as a co-owner of this property who has been making 100% of the mortgage payments, I have the right to force a sale of the house if the co-ownership arrangement is no longer working. Blake's knees literally buckled. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious, I replied. The lawyer explained that since you've been claiming sole ownership of a property that legally belongs to both of us, and since you've been accepting financial support under false pretenses, I have grounds to dissolve our arrangement and force the sale of the property. Victoria was staring at Blake with a mixture of horror and disgust. So not only do you not own this house, but you might not even have a place to live? Furthermore, I continued, since Blake has been representing himself as the sole owner while I've been making all the payments, my attorney believes I have a strong case for claiming the majority of any proceeds from a sale, minus Blake's equity contribution, which, as we've established, was $0. The party had essentially stopped. People throughout the house had become aware that something dramatic was happening in the living room, and a crowd had gathered to watch what was clearly the complete destruction of their host's credibility and lifestyle. Blake made one last desperate play. "Everyone, please don't listen to this. My mother has been having some cognitive issues lately, and she's obviously confused about our financial arrangement. I think the stress of aging has made her paranoid and delusional." That was his final mistake. The suggestion that I was cognitively impaired, combined with all the evidence I had just presented, turned the remaining sympathy in the room completely against Blake. Even people who might have been willing to overlook some financial exaggeration weren't going to stand by while someone attacked an elderly woman's mental capacity. Mr. Hendricks stepped forward with obvious authority. "Son, I've been evaluating people's financial competence for 30 years, and I can assure you that your mother is demonstrating perfect clarity and providing substantial documentation for her claims. You, on the other hand, have been caught in multiple lies and are now resorting to personal attacks to avoid accountability." Sarah nodded in agreement. "Blake, what your mother is describing isn't confusion, it's systematic financial support that you've been hiding from everyone, including your girlfriend." Victoria stood up slowly, looking around the room at all the faces staring at Blake with mixtures of disgust and pity. "I need to go," she said quietly. "Blake, don't call me, don't text me, we're done." She gathered her purse and coat and walked out of the house without another word. Several other guests began making similar moves toward the door, clearly uncomfortable with staying at a party hosted by someone who had just been exposed as a fraud. But I wasn't done yet. I had one final revelation that would ensure Blake understood the complete consequences of his choices. "There's one more thing everyone should know," I announced as people began gathering their belongings. "Blake, remember when you called me a confused old tenant who won't move out?" Blake's eyes were filled with panic, clearly understanding that whatever came next was going to be the final blow. "Well, you're right about one thing. I won't be moving out, but you will be." I pulled up the legal notice on my phone one more time. According to my attorney, as the person who has been making 100% of the mortgage payments on a property I co-own, I have the legal right to demand that Blake either start making his fair share of the payments or vacate the property. The room was completely silent except for the sound of Blake's labored breathing. "Starting tomorrow, Blake, you have 30 days to either take over the full mortgage payment of $1,847 per month, plus back pay me the $33,246 you owe me for the 18 months of payments I've covered, or you need to find somewhere else to live." Kevin, who was still holding his phone full of worthless financial advice notes, looked up with obvious satisfaction. "So the confused old tenant is actually evicting the landlord."
That's exactly right, I confirmed. Blake wanted to be seen as an independent homeowner who didn't need help from family. Now he can prove it by actually paying for his housing like an adult. Or he can move back to his childhood bedroom and explain to future dates why he's living with his mother again. Blake collapsed back onto the couch, the weight of his situation finally sinking in. His party was over. His girlfriend had left him, his guests had lost all respect for him, and he was about to lose his house unless he could somehow come up with nearly $35,000 plus ongoing monthly payments of almost $1,900. But perhaps most devastating of all, everyone now knew that the confident, successful, financially disciplined man he had been pretending to be was completely fictional. The respect and admiration he had worked so hard to cultivate had been destroyed in a single evening. As the remaining guests filed out of the house, many of them stopped to speak with me rather than Blake. Mr. Hendricks shook my hand warmly. "Ma'am, I apologize for not recognizing your situation earlier. What you've accomplished, supporting your son while building wealth through real estate, is genuinely impressive. You should be proud of your actual achievements." Sarah paused on her way out. "Mrs. Caldwell, would you be willing to give me some real advice about saving for a house down payment? After tonight, I think I'd rather learn from someone who actually knows what they're talking about."
Even Kevin, who had been so eager to learn from Blake's supposed expertise, stopped to ask if I might be willing to share some authentic financial guidance with someone just starting their career. As the last guest left, I found myself alone in the living room with Blake, who was sitting in stunned silence, surrounded by empty wine glasses and the remnants of his destroyed reputation. "Mom," he said quietly, "I think we need to talk." "No, Blake," I replied calmly. "We needed to talk 18 months ago when you decided to erase my contributions and take credit for my sacrifices. We needed to talk 6 months ago when you started lying to Victoria about our arrangement. We needed to talk tonight before you called me a confused old tenant in front of your friends." I gathered my purse and coat, preparing to leave. "What we need now is for you to decide whether you're going to start acting like the independent adult you've been pretending to be, or whether you're going to admit that you need help and start treating the people who help you with basic respect." Blake's voice was desperate. "Where are you going to go tonight?" I smiled for the first time in hours. "I'm going to stay at the Marriott downtown. Don't worry, I can afford it, since I've been saving money by not actually living like the financially irresponsible person you've been claiming I am." As I walked toward the door, Blake called after me one last time. "Mom, please, we can work this out. I'll start contributing more to the household expenses. I'll acknowledge your role in buying the house. Just don't destroy everything I've built." I turned back to look at my son, this man who had spent the evening accepting praise for character traits he didn't possess and achievements he hadn't earned. "Blake," I said quietly, "I didn't destroy anything tonight. You built your reputation on lies, and lies eventually collapse under their own weight. What happened tonight wasn't destruction, it was just truth finally catching up with fiction." I paused at the door. "When you're ready to have an honest conversation about our relationship and your future, you know where to find me. But it will be a conversation between equals, not between a generous benefactor and a grateful dependent." 3 months later, I was sitting in my new apartment, a lovely 2-bedroom place in downtown Willowbrook that I could easily afford with the money I was no longer spending on Blake's mortgage. The legal proceedings were surprisingly straightforward. Blake couldn't afford to keep the house without my financial support, and he couldn't afford to buy out my ownership share, so we sold the property and split the proceeds according to our actual contributions. After paying back the money I had invested, Blake was left with approximately $12,000 from the sale. Enough for a security deposit on a modest apartment, but not enough to maintain the lifestyle he had been projecting. Victoria never contacted him again. The colleagues who had been impressed by his supposed financial wisdom began avoiding him at work. Even his social media followers seemed to sense that something had changed, as his posts about success and wealth building received fewer and fewer likes and comments. But the most satisfying outcome was completely unexpected. 3 of the young people from Blake's party, Kevin, Sarah, and Lisa, had contacted me asking for genuine financial advice. We had been meeting monthly for what I called Real Talk About Money sessions, where I shared actual strategies for saving, budgeting, and building wealth. Unlike Blake's fictional advice, my guidance was based on decades of actual experience, working multiple jobs, sacrificing short-term pleasures for long-term goals, and making strategic financial decisions that built real security over time. Kevin had successfully saved enough for a down payment on a modest starter home. Sarah had eliminated her credit card debt and built an emergency fund. Lisa had started investing in her company's 401k program and was on track to buy her first property within 2 years. Their success was more satisfying than any revenge against Blake could have been, because it was based on truth rather than lies, and it was helping people achieve real goals rather than fake ones.
As for Blake, he eventually reached out through his attorney to propose a settlement for the money he still owed me. We agreed that he would make monthly payments of $300 toward his debt, which would take him several years to pay off, but would at least demonstrate some commitment to taking responsibility for his choices. He also sent a letter, not through lawyers, but directly, apologizing for his behavior at the party and acknowledging that he had been wrong to misrepresent our arrangement and dismiss my contributions. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a start.
The letter ended with a request to rebuild our relationship, this time based on honesty rather than the fiction he had been living in. He acknowledged that he needed to grow up, take responsibility for his finances, and treat me with the respect I deserved as both his mother and the person who had made his previous lifestyle possible. I haven't decided yet whether to respond to that letter. Some betrayals cut so deep that forgiveness requires more than just words and monthly payments. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was dealing with my actual son rather than the fictional character he had been playing. Meanwhile, I was discovering what it felt like to live authentically, to be recognized for my actual contributions, and to help people achieve real success rather than enabling fake achievements. At 70 years old, I had finally learned that being invisible in someone else's story was no way to live. The truth might be painful sometimes, but it was infinitely more satisfying than being complicit in a lie. And whenever I was tempted to feel guilty about exposing Blake's deception, I reminded myself of his words that night. She's basically just the old tenant who won't move out. Well, Blake was right about one thing. I didn't move out. But I did move on. A year later, I received an invitation to Kevin's housewarming party. He had successfully purchased a small but beautiful home using the genuine financial strategies we had discussed in our monthly meetings. The invitation included a note. Thank you for teaching me the difference between real financial wisdom and fake success stories. I can't wait to show you what actual disciplined saving and smart budgeting can accomplish. As I prepared to attend Kevin's celebration, I reflected on the difference between the two housewarming parties I had experienced. Blake's party had been a performance designed to impress people with fictional achievements. Kevin's party would be a genuine celebration of real accomplishment through actual hard work and sacrifice. I was proud to be part of a story based on truth rather than lies, contribution rather than exploitation, and mutual respect rather than manipulation. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting back at someone who hurt you. Sometimes it's simply choosing to live authentically and help others do the same. Blake had called me the old tenant who won't move out, thinking he was dismissing an embarrassing complication to his perfect image. What he didn't understand was that he had actually described the most important lesson of my 70 years. When you've earned your place in a story, you don't let anyone convince you to become invisible. You stand your ground, you tell your truth, and you build something real instead of something fake. And that's exactly what I did. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.